America's warning to Iran: why a U.S. carrier strike group is moving toward war. The warning was not subtle. When Donald Trump publicly declared that Iran's leadership would face hell to pay if the killing of protesters did not stop, it was framed as both a moral ultimatum and a strategic threat. Yet despite that warning, protesters continued to die in the streets. Others were arrested. Some were executed. Now, Washington is signaling that words alone are no longer sufficient. The arrival of the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln near Iran marks one of the most serious escalations between the United States and the Islamic Republic in years. This is not a routine patrol or a symbolic gesture. A full carrier strike group, complete with escorting destroyers, advanced aircraft, and layered missile defense, is positioning itself within striking distance of Iranian territory. For Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the clock is ticking. From protest to crackdown, how Iran reached this point. The current crisis began not with foreign intervention, but with domestic unrest. What started as protests by Iranian shopkeepers over worsening economic conditions quickly spread into a nationwide challenge to the ruling regime. As inflation soared and sanctions continued to choke the economy, frustration hardened into defiance. Iran's response followed a familiar pattern. Security forces were deployed, demonstrations were broken up with force, arrests mounted. Internet access was restricted or cut entirely in several regions, a move human rights groups argue was designed to conceal the scale of violence. By mid-January, thousands were reportedly dead. Independent verification remains difficult due to the blackout, but estimates ranged from several thousand confirmed deaths to far higher figures suggested by medical sources inside Iran. Even conservative counts acknowledged a death toll large enough to overwhelm hospitals and morgues. For protesters, the United States appeared to be their loudest international supporter, at least rhetorically. Trump's rhetoric and the limits of words. President Trump made his position unmistakable. Public statements and social media posts urged Iranian citizens to keep protesting and warned Iran's leadership that continued bloodshed would trigger consequences. Diplomatic engagements with Tehran were canceled. The language was confrontational, direct, and personal. At one point, Trump suggested that U.S. pressure had already worked, that killings were stopping and executions had been halted. That claim did not hold. Reports from inside Iran contradicted it almost immediately. As the death toll climbed, so did frustration among those risking their lives in the streets. For many protesters, Washington's threats began to feel hollow. Statements alone were not stopping bullets. That perception matters, because credibility is currency in geopolitics. The arrival of the Abraham Lincoln. On January 26, multiple outlets confirmed a significant U.S. military movement. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had repositioned from the western Indian Ocean toward the Middle East, entering waters from which Iran could be struck far more easily. A U.S. carrier is not just a ship. It is a floating airbase crewed by roughly 5,000 sailors and carrying dozens of combat aircraft. The Abraham Lincoln's air wing includes multi-role fighter jets, early warning aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and logistics aircraft capable of sustaining operations for extended periods. Escorting the carrier are 3 guided missile destroyers equipped with offensive missiles and advanced air defense systems designed to intercept drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic threats. In military terms, this force can conduct precision airstrikes, sustained aerial campaigns, maritime interdiction, missile defense for regional allies. It does not require reinforcements to be lethal. Reinforcements would only determine scale and duration, what the deployment signals, and what it doesn't. Importantly, the carrier's arrival does not automatically mean war is imminent. The United States has moved carrier groups into the region many times without launching strikes. But context matters. This deployment follows explicit presidential threats, mass civilian deaths, reports of executions, Iran's placement of its own armed forces on high alert. It also comes without the usual buildup associated with a full invasion. Strategic bomber bases such as Diego Garcia have not seen large bomber deployments. Instead, cargo flights and air defense assets suggest preparation for escalation rather than an immediate offensive. That ambiguity may be deliberate. Iran's response: high alert and hard warnings. Iran's leadership responded as expected, public restraint paired with private alarm. Officials acknowledged the U.S. buildup and confirmed that Iran's armed forces had been placed on high alert. One senior Iranian official warned that any U.S. strike, no matter how limited, would be treated as an act of total war. Unlike previous confrontations, the regime claims it would not calibrate or de-escalate its response. This threat cannot be dismissed outright. Iran possesses multiple tools for retaliation, including missile strikes on U.S. bases in the region, attacks via proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, disruption of shipping routes, particularly the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's petroleum passes through that narrow channel daily. Even temporary disruption would ripple through global energy markets. Lessons from Operation Midnight Hammer. Iran's credibility, however, is complicated by recent history. During Operation Midnight Hammer, U.S. forces reportedly struck Iranian nuclear facilities using over 100 aircraft. Iran's retaliation, missile launches toward a U.S. base in Qatar, was limited and largely intercepted. President Trump himself publicly dismissed that response as weak and expected. The precedent suggests Iran may threaten far more than it can realistically execute, especially when facing overwhelming U.S. military superiority. Still, limited retaliation does not mean no retaliation. Even small attacks can escalate unpredictably. The role of proxies and regional instability. One of the greatest risks lies not in direct U.S.-Iran conflict, but in indirect escalation. Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq and Yemen have signaled readiness to strike U.S. assets. Airlines have already begun rerouting flights to avoid Iranian and Iraqi airspace. Proxy warfare blurs accountability and complicates response. A missile launched by a militia can trigger retaliation against Iran itself, even if Tehran denies direct involvement. This dynamic increases the chance of miscalculation. Is regime change the goal? The most critical question remains unanswered. What does Trump actually want? Analysts are divided. Some believe the deployment is meant to coerce concessions, ending the crackdown, reviving nuclear negotiations, or forcing limited reforms. Others argue that the administration may see Iran's internal unrest as a rare opportunity to weaken or even remove the regime entirely. Regime change carries enormous risks. Removing Khamenei would create a power vacuum in a country with multiple armed factions, ideological divides, and regional entanglements. History offers few examples where such transitions end cleanly. At the same time, maintaining the status quo after thousands of civilian deaths carries moral and political costs of its own. What happens next? Several scenarios are possible. 1. Negotiated de-escalation. The carrier's presence pressures Iran into halting executions and easing repression without a shot fired. 2. Limited U.S. strikes. Precision attacks against Iranian military infrastructure or leadership targets designed to punish without toppling the regime. 3. Regional escalation. Proxy attacks trigger retaliation, pulling multiple countries into a widening conflict. 4. Strategic standoff. Neither side fires, but the region remains on edge, with constant risk of accidental war. Each option carries consequences that extend far beyond Iran's borders. Power, protest, and uncertainty. The movement of the US Abraham Lincoln toward Iran is not just a military maneuver, it is a test of credibility, resolve, and restraint. For Iran's protesters, it represents a belated acknowledgement of their suffering. For Tehran's leadership, it is a reminder that repression has external costs. For the United States, the challenge is balancing moral outrage with strategic caution. War is not inevitable, but neither is peace. As carrier decks fill with fueled aircraft and radar screens light up across the Gulf, the world is watching to see whether this moment becomes another chapter in geopolitical brinkmanship, or the opening act of something far more destructive. The answer, as always, will depend less on firepower than on decisions made behind closed doors. If you want clear, fact-driven breakdowns of global conflicts without the noise, hype, or propaganda, this is the place for it. These stories are unfolding in real time, and understanding them matters more than ever. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, like and subscribe for more deep, serious coverage you won't get from headlines alone.